Well, it looks like we're having a bit of technical difficulties with the videos, but that's okay. I'll just announce that at the bottom of the screen, there is an interpretation button. If you click on that, you can access either Spanish or Vietnamese translation or interpretation, excuse me. Hopefully we can get those videos next time, but thank you. And we can go forward to the next slide. Okay. So welcome everyone. Thank you again for coming. I'll give a chance to our San Jose staff to introduce themselves. While I'm doing that, I'm going to give you a chance to introduce yourself in the chat button. Where we are in the what we're going to talk about tonight is Copa. We're going to intro with where we are in the process. We'll give an overview of the draft framework, and then we'll have time for feedback and question and answers. We'll go through that element by element. And we'll say that in the last few meetings that we've had, they've been scheduled for an hour and a half, and we have gone to 2 hours. So we're prepared tonight to go to 6 o'clock with interpretation. So if we need to stay late and go to 6, we're happy to do that. If there are more questions, then we can get answered in our time here today. So we can go to the next slide and do some introductions. So I'll ask Kristen first to introduce herself. And again, if you as a participant would like to put into the chat your name and the organization that you represent, if you are here representing an organization, that would be great. Kristen, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, thanks, Elizabeth. I'm Kristen Clements. I'm with the Housing Department in San Jose, and I oversee the policy team among some other things. And I apologize in advance if you can't hear me very well. I've been under the weather, so let me know if I need to sit closer to the speaker. Thanks.
Thank you. Josh?
Hi all, thank you so much for being here. I'm Josh Ishimotsu with the City of San Jose Housing Department, and I am on the policy team.
Thanks, Josh. And Asen.
Hi folks, I'm Asen NDI. I'm the Partnership for the Base Future Fellow here in the City of San Jose's Housing Department. Good to see y'all.
Great, thank you. And thanks to those of you that are putting your introducing yourself in the chat, and thank you for helping to explain how to access the translation as well. And if we could go to the next slide. So where we are in the process, in September of 2020, the City Council approved the citywide residential anti-displacement strategy, which included direction to explore Copa. So that is what we've been doing since April of last year until October. We had a community engagement process where we had a technical team and a larger advisory group that met. During that time, we had about 50 meetings, over 160 people engaged. We talked to representatives from all of these sectors here, and we were able to develop a draft framework with all of that input that we received during that process. So what we've been doing now is we're in the public review of a draft framework. So we've had a draft framework published since December, and the public review period will be open until the end of January. So we've been holding several public meetings during that time to discuss Copa, and have been encouraging people to submit questions and comments on the public draft. And then in the winter and spring coming up, we have our Housing Commission and City Council committee review meetings, and then on to City Council. So you can go to the next slide. So today we want to give you an overview of this proposed program and bring everyone up to the same level of knowledge on this proposal. So we're not going to try to get through a description of the entire program proposal as all of, we are going to try to get through a description of the entire program proposal as all of the elements fit together, and then we will open it up to questions for the second half of the session. So if you have a question as we go along, please do not raise your hand yet. Just please make a note of it or type your question into the Q&A. Excuse me, not the Q&A. We don't have the Q&A. We have just the chat. So you can put your question into the chat. So we appreciate your time and working with us to get through this description. And I'm sorry, I have like a little frog in my throat, so I'm gonna have to mute myself for just a second and cough a little. That's much better. Okay, if you could go to the next slide. So we're gonna start out with a definition of Copa. It's a proposed community opportunity to purchase program, which gives qualified nonprofit organizations an opportunity to make the first offer to buy rental residential properties before properties are put on the open market, and the right to make a final offer to match terms and conditions of a third-party bid. Note that this program would not require the sale of the building to a qualified nonprofit. The only requirement under the program would be for the owner who is going to sell their building to go through a prescribed process. Who the owner ultimately sells to is up to the owner. Next slide, please. So the goals of Copa are this. There are several reasons why we're proposing this program. The purpose is to prevent displacement and to preserve existing low-cost housing. Properties purchased by QMPs through the Copa would be preserved as restricted affordable housing to the extent that they qualify for city subsidies that keep rents low. Copa would be a way to give tenants greater opportunity to gain knowledge and participate in the process of their building being sold. Buildings could either continue to be rented or could be eventually converted to home ownership opportunities or other ownership structures that would promote wealth building. Next slide, please. So here's our framework. Opportunity to purchase programs generally have similar program elements. Here we have applicability. So that's what units the program would apply to. The timeline for transactions, the buyers. So here would be the qualified nonprofits and community partners. Income eligibility and targets, tenant engagement, and education and enforcement. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to pass it over to Ace, who's going to start us off with applicability. I will put into the chat a copy of the draft framework from our website. So if you'd like to follow along there, you can. Again, if you have questions during this time, if you could just either hold on to them or put them into the chat, that would be great. We'll keep the chat open unless we have any inappropriate behavior in the chat. We'll shut it down, but we'll leave it open for now. So thank you for that. And Eason, go ahead with applicability. Thank you.
Hi, folks. Again, as Elizabeth said, applicability just means essentially what properties are actually going to be included in this program. I know a lot of folks, especially if it's your first meeting, may have heard about this program and really are unsure whether or not the property in which you live or potentially properties that you either manage or own are going to be covered by this program. We talked to a lot of folks in the last 6 months about what this program could mean. We heard from tenants who are living in a bunch of different types of living situations. We heard from property owners who were somewhat concerned about whether or not their properties were going to be included in the program. We also heard about specific situations that folks thought would not really work for this program, specifically, especially in many cases in which people, for example, own a duplex and they live in one half of it. Based on that and based on the existing housing stock here in San Jose, especially looking at the fact that nearly 2/3 of renters live in multifamily units. What we know, of course, is that those who are most impacted generally live in multifamily units as well. We thought that the best way for this program to work would be to include all properties that are at least 2 units. Of course, that would also mean that single homes, which are about 1/3 of the entire rental market, would not be included. We heard a lot of concerns from renters who live in single family homes, sometimes in many cases overcrowded in single family homes, that they should be included. But we also heard from a lot of cases in which single family homes that are up for rental are usually owned by sometimes a relative or was inherited. And so we just thought that to make it a lot easier for us to be able to manage this, we would just start at 2 units. We also heard that there were specific cases in which this program would be a little bit more difficult to manage or to include. So that is, of course, cases in which the owner resides on the property, up to 4 units. We also heard that folks wanted to be able to pass on their property to family members, direct family members. And so those would not be included. So people will be able to pass on property to children, for example, and making sure that we're able to preserve their generational wealth. There are specific processes and rules for, especially in government processes, that would an issue for Copa. So those would be foreclosures, it would be divorces, eminent domain, and in those cases, Copa would not apply. And then finally, there are some cases, especially for larger properties, in which only some portion of the ownership of the property, especially, for example, REITs, where only some portion of the ownership of the property changes, and that does not trigger an actual sale, and those would also not be included. Next slide. So to talk a little bit about what COPA is, this community opportunity is a way to create a process that gives qualified nonprofits, mission-driven, community-based, qualified nonprofits the ability to make an initial offer for a property. And what that looks like in practice is that the property owner would issue a notice of sale to these qualified nonprofits. These qualified nonprofits would get a certain period of time to let the property owner know that they're interested in looking at the property. Usually for a lot of qualified nonprofits, there are only certain kinds of properties that they're really usually looking at. And so if the property is not really within that type of property, then they're not gonna really likely put in a statement of interest. Following that, if they do put in a statement of interest, there's going to be a little bit of period of due diligence in which a qualified nonprofit can sort of, get a chance to understand what the property's financials are, any sort of deferred maintenance or rehab that needs to occur, and then put together an offer. After they put together an offer, the owner has the complete control and decision-making ability to just refuse that offer. The only thing that we ask is that if the property owner ends up refusing the offer, that they give the qualified nonprofit an opportunity to match that offer. And even after the property owner receives that matching offer, they still have the control and still have the option to refuse even the matching offer and sell to a private party. However, of course, if they receive a matching offer, they're able to accept that offer and go with the qualified nonprofit. I'm going to say a couple of things before we move on, and it's just to reiterate. The first is in that first step, when the owner issues that notice of sale, what we've seen from a lot of other jurisdictions that have opportunity to purchase programs, that's usually the only step. That means that they issue the notice of sale, they don't receive a statement of interest from any of the qualified nonprofits, and it goes straight back up to the open market and goes through the existing process. So it's usually a short period of time for most folks. And then the last thing that I just want to reiterate is that that matching offer at the end is non-binding, which means that the property owner gets to accept or refuse even that final offer. And the other thing too is that the qualified nonprofit can come back and put up even a greater offer than what the private market had offered in the first place. Next slide. What we know from talking to property owners and also looking at the data is that really you're talking about 2 different markets when you're looking at 2 to 4 units and properties that are 5 units or above. For 2 to 4 units, properties tend to sell a lot more quickly. And so what we thought about putting together as far as the timeline is concerned, something that generally looks like what the existing market is currently doing, but also trying to make sure that we're sort of creating a process that also works for the qualified nonprofits. What that's meant is that we're going to have a process that starts with that notice of sale, as I mentioned in the last slide, and give 15 days for the qualified nonprofits to put in a statement of interest. After that, they would get 25 days to do that due diligence and put together an offer. And then if the property owner accepts the offer, we're giving them about 60 days to go ahead and secure financing and close the transaction. As I mentioned, in the existing market, 2 to 4 units, they tend to close very quickly. But also, because it's a smaller property, the overall sale amount is a lot lower, so it doesn't require as much financing in order to be able to close. Next slide. For properties that are 5 or above, of course, that means that even in the existing market, these properties tend to sit on the market a lot longer than the smaller properties. We also know the purchase price is a lot larger, obviously. And of course, it also means that there are fewer buyers for those properties. And so we try to match the sort of first 2 initial steps of the 2 to 4. So it's going to be 15 days, same as the other timeline, and another 25 days to put together an offer, again, same as the other timeline. The only thing that we ask is a few more days, 40 more days, 100 days total, to be able to secure financing in order to be able to close the transaction. What we heard from the qualified nonprofits or potential qualified nonprofits is that the larger the property, most likely they're going to need to line up multiple sources of financing. And what that 100 days does is that it just allows the qualified nonprofit to be able to secure and finalize that financing. Next slide. Okay, I'll pass it to Josh.
So for the nonprofit organizations that get the opportunity under Copa to submit early offers on properties before they go to the market, we want to be sure that these organizations have the capacity, the know-how, and the resources to close a transaction and to develop and manage a property. So we want to ensure that the organizations who receive this benefit are nonprofit organizations with a specific mission to provide public benefit through affordable housing, have experience and track record to be able to complete the transaction and run the housing, like I said. For these reasons, City of San Jose will have an application process and will qualify organizations based upon their nonprofit status, their mission, their track record for both what they've done recently and their overall experience in developing affordable housing. And we'll call these organizations qualified nonprofits or QNPs. Our recommended development experience requirement for a QNP is to have completed 2 publicly funded affordable housing projects in the past 5 years and 4 projects overall, preferably with projects of similar scope and scale. So acquisition, rehab, preservation projects. Actually, I'm going to stick with the last slide. I'm not going to move this yet. And that in addition to the development track record, we also want potential Copa buyers to be rooted in San Jose, to have a mission to advance in justice and equity in San Jose, to be committed to empowering tenants, and to have a track record with direct engagement of tenants. So we understand that not all nonprofit affordable housing developers will meet some of the above criteria. So QMPs, so nonprofit affordable housing developers, can partner with community-based organizations to fulfill these requirements. And so we'll want to see that, that we'll be certifying these QMP partnerships or relationships together. And, we'll be pre-qualifying these organizations together. And it is also our intent to provide technical assistance and capacity building to community partner organizations about the development process, how to be engaged partner, and for some of them to eventually transition into doing projects themselves. Also affordability. So we will be having, for properties that end up being purchased by nonprofit organizations, we will be requiring them to provide this housing as affordable housing for people who are low income and very low income. So a 30 to 80% area median income, which is sort of like a term of art in the affordable housing field. But basically that these would be low to very low income people. And that with the overall portfolio that we end up funding acquisitions for through the housing department, that we'd want to have a goal for about 50% area median income, which is averaged across the entire portfolio, and would be that's basically very low income. The portfolio goal would not be a strict requirement for each of the individual purchasers, but is something, like I said, it would be across the whole entire portfolio of what San Jose funds. For home ownership, we'd require that income eligibility be targeted more in the 60 to 120% area median income range, which is low income to moderate income. In both cases, for both rental and home ownership, because one of the fundamental purposes of Copa is to prevent displacement, as we've discussed, existing tenants would not be evicted or forced to leave on the basis of their income eligibility. This was a strong consensus from what we heard in our stakeholder and community engagement process. So, if a existing tenant is over income, they would be allowed to stay. Likewise, if an existing tenant is under income, they would also be allowed. They should also be allowed to stay, and that there may be some adjustments in rent for these tenants, but it would be in line with all other sort of regulations that apply to the property. Finally, for all properties purchased under Copa, we'd want that the rent escalation be consistent with ARO rent stabilized properties. So maximum of 5% of annual increase to rents. So I will change the slide, and Kristen.
Thanks, Josh. So one element that we propose in the Copa program that just providing preservation funds alone would not accomplish the same way is that there be an element of tenant engagement in the program. Tenant engagement is important for properties that are being bought that have existing lower rents, because this can be a very stressful time for renters. They realize that the new property owners may increase rents, may change their lease provisions, they may need to move. And so it brings up a lot of questions for them and a lot of stress. And so our thought is that this program would require the qualified nonprofit or their community partner. In case the nonprofit was not based in San Jose, we would ask them to team with a nonprofit that exists in our city and could help with neighbor outreach and resident outreach and kind of help educate about the program generally. And so we would require that this team demonstrate efforts to reach out to the residents to educate about the program, and also, for instance, let people know what's coming. They will need to provide income information if this property is turning into restricted affordable housing, and that might be new for them. So this outreach could explain why that's the case. Obviously would convey some more information about the potential buyer. And that we see this falling into different stages. When we say pre-acquisition, we anticipate this after a QNP decides that they do want to make an offer on a property. And again, the effort is to reach out to tenants, and at the same time, we know the potential buyers need to respect the desires of the existing property owner as to how to access the site and how and when it might be acceptable to contact tenants. And so, so there needs to be kind of respect on both sides and perhaps some communication about that with the offer period. But during the transaction period, when the QNP were doing due diligence and preparing to close on the sale, if the transaction goes in that path, we would require that they do provide evidence of communication with residents. So at first it's more on the effort side, and then the question is, are our residents being informed adequately? So we'd ask that they submit some information about that to the city. And then finally, as the QNP closes on the property and purchases the property, if the owner decides that that's what organization they want to sell to for a price that the two of them determine, after acquisition, we would expect that the qualified nonprofits would support generally the tenant organizing efforts. And for instance, if the tenants wanted to form a cooperative to make an offer in case the nonprofit were anticipating sale of the property at some time in the future, that would sell as a restricted affordable building, but written into an agreement with the city could be that the tenants, while they may not be ready today to make an offer, eventually we intend and hope that some more tenant organizing will occur in our market, and so that they could have the support that they need to form a tenant co-op to make an offer on the building at a later time, if that initial purchasing nonprofit developer chooses to sell. So again, we see the tenants piece of this as an important element to the program, and one that would be missing if all we did was just offer some dollars to affordable developers to do deals in certain places without the Copa program being in place. Next slide. Finally, the topic comes up: how will this program be enforced? How will everybody in the market know about it? And what will the city's role be and intention be about those who may not follow the directions in the ordinance? So every time we talk about this, it comes up as to whether it is legal for the city to put in place an ordinance that prescribes a process to sell. And I wanted to say up front that our lawyers are totally comfortable that we're working on this program, that it is allowable for a city to put in place an ordinance that is enforced, that says, here are the steps that we would expect people to follow when they are selling the properties covered under the ordinance. So just wanted to say that up front. But really the point of the whole program is to get more restricted affordable housing, to help stabilize residents in certain key neighborhoods, and really to achieve the goals of the program. And so we know that initial and ongoing outreach to people who own buildings in the market and their representatives, of course, is totally critical. And so if the city council were to direct staff to go ahead and draft an ordinance for its consideration, we'd be continuing public outreach, that the program is going through a public process of approvals, obviously. But if we get to the ordinance stage, we would know that their intention is to move forward on it. We would put together an outreach plan. We would be working with key stakeholders to reach even hard to reach residents in their membership. And we would have several months, approximately a year, before the ordinance were to become effective. So our thought is that we would draft an effective date that was the later of two dates, either the date that's 12 months after the city council's approval of the ordinance, or a date that we would give notice, and the notice would say council passed the ordinance, but also there are qualified nonprofits ready to participate in the program. We would also have to have created some more specific regulations to go with the program, just rules and forms, things like that. So all of that would be ready to go when the effective date came about. So anyway, our intention is to spend a long time doing outreach and a lot of effort. So again, our focus is on education. We anticipate having perhaps a staff of 1 FTE, something very small for the program. And because that person would not be able to do a lot of outreach and proactively look at properties that were up for sale to see if the process were going correctly, the program would operate on a complaint basis, where somebody would call in and say, my building's up for sale. I have this indication that, the owner is not following this ordinance, as an example. And so complaint basis is the idea there. And the other idea is that the program would echo other city programs that we have in place, like the tenant protection ordinance, in the way that it is administratively enforced. And so we would propose similar administrative guidelines as to how staff would behave, what letters, the initial offense would get a letter for the property owner that had not followed the program rules. And then if it was seen that the program owner had been educated after a certain point and had a second offense, then they would start to merit fines. And so really only repeat offenses that seem to be intentional, even after education was provided, would really get a bad actor owner in trouble. And so we're going to put it that way. So be scaled up fines. Again, very similar to other city programs. We would be just in line with those fees. I think the highest fees that I have seen, because we've been asked this, they start low in the low 100s of dollars and then can ramp up to 10,000 for repeated, somewhat seemingly intentional offenses. So that's the range we're talking about. Along with the small staff, a private right of action would be proposed so that somebody like a nonprofit law firm or for-profit who felt like there was legal basis to bring a complaint on the behalf of somebody who could make findings would be included. So again, very analogous to our other programs. But I want to say that the question had come up, shouldn't we do this as a voluntary program and not really have any enforcement? And we think that something that is this complicated and takes this long to put together and could do some good is worth enforcing, even lightly, as we're proposing. So this is the light kind of path, rather than having a lot of staff that building owners would have to pay for somehow through fees. That is not what we're proposing. This is kind of the light path that we are proposing, if that makes sense. So with that, I will hand it back to Elizabeth.
Thank you, Kristen. Thanks also to Josh and Eason. So we've come to the end of the overview of the draft framework. Thank you for your patience and listening and submitting questions during that time. Those of you that have put questions in the chat, thank you. We are noting them and we'll have time here to start answering them. I do want to say that we are also, we'll take questions by raise of hand. And if you know how to use that function, if you go to the bottom of your screen to that little reactions button, you can raise your hand that way. So we'll start taking questions both ways. I will note that we have a lot of people here tonight. We're gonna want to see if we can hear from some people we haven't heard yet from in this process. So Martha, I do see that your hand up was first, and we can take your question as we get to the others in the chat. So Martha, if you want to unmute yourself and state your question, please do.
Yeah, and by the way, I don't ask repeat questions. So just because I may have asked one before, I don't ask repeats. Okay, I sent Kristen this email on January 10th at 8:23 a.m. And I'm going to ask the question. According to last Friday's presentation, Copa presentation, if the building was purchased under Copa, these folks' rent would be increased to 30% of the income. I think, Kristen, you remember that. This was something Cheryl wrote. She says that their new rent would be $5,000 per month. So I just need to know if what Cheryl posted was accurate, because that's very concerning to me.
No, rent of $5,000 a month is not accurate.
Is their rent going to go up at all? If they've already been living there, is their rent going to go up?
So let me just say the first concept and let Josh elaborate if he likes. The idea is in affordable housing is that residents pay 30% of the income level of the profile, if you will, and a household family size. That's appropriate. And so affordable housing lets you right size the rents. If people are paying a very low proportion of their incomes for rent, which generally is not true for low income people here, the opposite's the case, then rent would be adjusted up for people who are like moderate income, for instance. So and the opposite would occur for people who were paying too much for their rent. So the effort would be, if somebody's paying 60% of their gross income for rent, that their rent burden would come down, because that is not sustainable for people through this purchase and financial restructuring of the property. So that's big picture. I don't know if Josh wants to add anything. But in no case will rent be going to $5,000 a month. That doesn't make sense.
I mean, if rent would go to $5,000 a month, that's somebody who's making like over $15,000 a month.
That's the rent appropriate for a Class A high-rise new, right? So no one would charge that anyway, because obviously people would shift out of that unit and go get something different. So anyway.
Okay, I just want to I won't hog time. It's 30 seconds. I'm really concerned that anybody's rent is going to go up at all under this program. Thank you.
Martha. Oh, somehow I was muted. Thank you, Martha. Okay, so let's go to a question that we got earlier in the chat. This question was from Carlos, and I think he was speaking to the amount of transactions that have occurred similarly to this in the last 5 years, and kind of gets to the need for this program. And he's asking, do we really need to put everyone through this if there's been so few transactions like these in the last few years? I'm wondering maybe if Josh would like to answer that.
I'm not sure that I understand the question. I don't know what the 2 in the last 5 years means.
I think the question is, if a limited number of buildings end up getting subsidized by the city, why put many property owners through a different process. I'm paraphrasing.
I mean, I don't think it's going to be 2 and 5 years. It'll be substantially more than that. It's not going to be a huge volume program, but it'll be more than 2 and 5 years. And you know, I mean, I think that it's not just about. I mean, it is the individual affordable housing that gets produced. This is important and valuable, but there's also a market changing function in increasing overall transparency in the market, for nonprofits to have a foot in the door in the process. And I think that, you know, ultimately 90% of properties plus will have very little effect. So it's not that I mean, I think that, you know, we're trying to figure out a process that is not excessive for everyone, and that it's more for the properties that one would be of interest for nonprofits, which is probably, you know, less than 10% of the properties that would go into the market, and two, that you know, that the longer timelines are timelines that sellers would opt into. So.
Great. Thank you. And this could be a follow-up to that. This question came in from Amy, and she was asking just about how often do QMPs make offers? How often are QMP offers accepted by owners? How often do they match offers? And how often are QMP matches offers accepted by owners? You know, a lot of that information, you know, we don't yet have, but I'm wondering, Josh, if you could speak to kind of maybe what sort of what is projected and what we've seen in other areas.
Sure. In our discussions with San Francisco, which has a Copa program, their staff estimate that, you know, like, as I said, you know, 90% plus properties are not of interest to QMPs. I think that we don't have the exact percentage of, like, if it's of interest, what properties are offered upon, but you know, our impression is that it's a relatively high percentage of properties that are offered on, you know, that are offered on by nonprofits. They actually get purchased by the nonprofits, and that sellers, you know, actually like those offers in general. And we even heard of one case where the owner rejected the nonprofit offer but wanted to come back to it. So you know, I think that it's ends up being something that I think where the offers are, you know, typically a fair market value. You know, owners don't have to choose to go with them, but they're typically good offers.
Great, thank you. Let's go to someone who has their hand raised, Steve Cohen. If you would like to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yeah, sorry, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, great. So I buy historic properties that are distressed, and I buy them with hard money. Do you know what hard money is? That was the question.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I buy with hard money, private money, right? Because I do quick closings, and then I fix up the properties, and I go to a conventional loan. Aren't you, with this with the delay in the process of 40 days from posting, all of a sudden cutting people like me out of the process, because no hard money guy who's going to be at 10% or higher is going to wait 40 days to find out if a nonprofit even wants to put an offer in, and I think that's my question, but I'm going to give you a statement also. I think that you're really manipulating the market and cutting out the little guys like me from being able to do what we do and giving nonprofits an advantage. I mean, you're changing the time element now, and then nonprofits don't have to pay property taxes. I mean, how much of an edge is it really fair, to have over the little guy, whereas this is what we do for a living, and I actually don't sell my properties. I keep them. I'm not a flipper. I keep them, restore them, and rent them. But this whole process just doesn't seem fair. And to make it fair, I would say, or fairer, I would say that any properties that are already covered under rent control should be exempt from this process, because anybody who owns a property under rent control already has an issue with selling it, because they've got to deal with the rent control laws, existing tenants, and buyouts. And then you want to throw this on top of it. That's absolutely not fair. So you can answer the first part, and the rest of what I said is a statement. And I think that you should really consider taking any properties that are under rent control off this Copa. Thanks.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks for your comments. Sounds like you have some big concerns about the impacts of this program. But
if I could just comment on that, and thanks, Steve, for talking to us about your business model and how you work in our market. That's helpful information. I think you're right. This would be asking to change the process for buildings covered by the ordinance. That said, all buildings would not be covered by the ordinance, as Asen kind of went through. And so I think the other piece is what we're trying to do is hard. We're trying to do restricted affordable housing with rents, per Cheryl's question. Yes, that would be capped in escalation, whatever the ARO ordinance says. But more than that, the rents would be right-sized for people who don't make very much money. And so I think the question of fairness is really about how do we help make a very small segment of the market more responsive to the people who live in San Jose. So, 45% of the residents in San Jose are low income. It's all residents. And so our market is increasingly expensive for them. And we are having we can't produce our way out of this problem with new restricted affordable buildings. Preservation has to be part of this answer too. So you're right, this would be a change, and this would be the first time we focused on preservation of existing buildings. And thank you for your comment on the ARO properties. We've taken that down. Thanks.
So Steve, to get to the first part of your question, I
think we need to keep going though, Josh. There are a lot of questions in the chat.
Oh my God. So you're not going to answer the question?
I'm sorry. Feel fine. Josh, go ahead. I'm seeing comments asking that we keep moving too. So I just wanted to but feel free.
You wouldn't be precluded from doing your business as you described it, purchasing and developing properties as you described it. You wouldn't be able to put a hard offer down during the 40-day period, but after that, there's no reason why you wouldn't be able to do that.
Then you obviously don't understand how hard money works. And yes, you're shutting me out. And when you say
I don't think.
Josh, you know I'm sorry. I understand and I respect what you guys are trying to do, but when you say it's a small part of the properties being sold, I only own 5 properties. So if I got shut out of 1 or 2 or 3, that's a lot of properties. And I really get the feeling that you guys have never dealt with the real estate industry. When I listen to all these meetings and other real estate people and their comments, you guys aren't real estate people. You don't work in
Okay,
this.
Steve, thank you. Duly noted. We're going
Steve.
to move on to other questions.
Yeah, we have a lot of questions here, and we understand that, there are a lot of concerns. We definitely want to hear them, but we also need to kind of keep things moving and answer, as many questions as we can. So we appreciate your comment and your question, Steve. So let's get to a question that we got a couple questions about offers. So I'm thinking Asen might be able to take this one, but Leticia had a question. If more than 2 nonprofit organizations offer different amounts for the same property, how would that choice be made? And who gets that choice?
Yeah, so actually we've had this discussion a couple of times in some of the community engagement process. I think our ideal situation is that we only get 1 qualified nonprofits in the process, primarily because we want the qualified nonprofit that's making the offer. First of all, not to really bidding up is probably the wrong word here, but really we're trying as much as possible for the qualified nonprofits to be able to get the best deal that they can. But at the same time, we also want to make sure that the relationship between the residents and the qualified nonprofits are built and are maintained. And so one of the things that we noticed from the other programs and other jurisdictions is that the qualified nonprofits tend to have some tie to that community, to that area, or to that neighborhood. This is true of DC, and this is true of San Francisco. And so I think our goal with the development and the implementation of Copa is going to be to try and build relationships between qualified nonprofits, community partners, and certain areas and communities around San Jose to, as much as possible, reduce that having that occurrence. At the same time, I don't think there would be any way to actually stop it. But Kristen, no, you look like you were about to say something.
No, I was just going to say the whole setup of the program is to get 1 offer from 1 qualified nonprofit. That's why we're asking for time in the timeline for the qualified nonprofits to communicate together about who would make the offer and not to have multiple offers.
Ultimately, if there were somewhere that there were more than 1 offer, and this is also true when it's an offer between, QMP and on the private market, say for example, when it's the final offer or the final decision, ultimately the seller decides which offer to go with. Also.
Thank you.
Okay. Next question.
Thanks. Let's hear from Sandy Perry, who has your hand up. If you could go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hi, I had a question around the qualifications for the qualified nonprofit. I'm on the board of, and I would like to point out that a lot of the, contrary to some of what I heard, people are painting these nonprofits as kind of large corporations. And in fact, any nonprofits that are interested in these types of deals are very small. South Bay Community Land Trust is a very small, just got formed nonprofit, and we are interested in becoming a qualified nonprofit, but it appears that the way the required characteristics for qualified nonprofits would prevent us from being eligible for doing that. So what could be done to allow nonprofits which do not have experience, which are just starting, which I think one of the aims of the program is to get more nonprofits involved in this type of business. How can that happen if this level of experience is required before a nonprofit is even eligible?
Thanks for your question, Sandy. So maybe Josh, you can speak to evaluating the experience and building up the experience of QMP.
So Sandy, I mean, that's an important set of questions. Thank you for your question. We feel that this is part of the requirements are part of what is in line with what we see out there in terms of what other nonprofit lenders like Enterprise and LISC, what sorts of requirements that they have for their acquisition financing. So that's where the requirements, the proposed requirements come from. We also share the concern that there be small nonprofits that are able to develop the capacity to eventually become QMPs. We anticipate this happening through we're exploring capacity building programs, and that in partnering with other developers organizations, smaller organizations, startup organizations could begin to build the track record to become QMPs in the future as well.
Thanks, Josh, and thanks for your question, Sandy. Here's sort of a follow-up question from the chat about QMPs. As long as we're on the topic, Jeff had asked, well, what happened to a QMP if they're failing to operate the properties adequately? What kind of oversight and penalties might there be?
I could take that. Part of running the program is administering the little group of qualified nonprofits. We would need to have some kind of performance criteria in there. We don't, the last thing that anybody wants is to have properties that get a lot of complaints in the neighborhoods because there's some kind of property management challenge. So that said, we would be integrating some kind of guidance on track record under the program, as well as we were to qualify the next group of QNPs that could participate in the program. The other point of that is that as these buildings, to the extent that they qualify for city subsidy and can become subsidized affordable apartments, the city as a lender also has controls that the city as just a, kind of regulator over here does not have. And so as a lender, we can weigh in on, we have rights and responsibilities under our loan agreement about adequate property management, and can work with folks on challenges as well. So there are a lot of different paths to make sure that they're performing correctly in the neighborhoods.
Great, thank you. Okay, let's go to someone who has their hand up. Kelsey, I see you have your hand up. If you could unmute yourself and speak your question.
Sure, thanks. My name is Kelsey Baines. I work for YIMBY Action, and we advocate for welcoming communities where everyone can thrive. This is the first of these meetings that I've been able to go to, and it's been interesting to watch and interesting to hear more material. This was a policy that was really popular in our Housing Policy Leadership Academy. About half the groups focused on this policy. So it's interesting to see it being put into action. I'm personally really interested in this topic because this happened to me as a tenant. So I lived in a 3-unit property that I rented, and it was sold while I was living there for $3 million, sold in 3 days, and was slated for redevelopment. So I had to move. I moved to a new neighborhood where I paid $400 more a month in rent. And I was privileged to be able to do that because I recognize that because I've seen another experience play out in my professional capacity. I am a clinician, and when it was my turn in our supportive housing clinic to field calls from folks, I would hear calls from people who were becoming homeless because their property that they rented for a long time was sold. Particularly alarming number of seniors having that experience. And it's really devastating and traumatic to become homeless. And it's a very cost-effective solution to prevent it from happening in the first place. So I am getting to a question, but my question is about you touched on it in the presentation about tenants having kind of a path to purchase through the qualified nonprofit. But I was curious, is there a way for tenants to have a direct way to purchase if they, for some reason, could get together the funds just to have that opportunity? So I guess my question is it a matter of having insufficient funds? So you want to make sure it's going to an entity that is qualified, or is it a matter of like not giving people permission if things could go awry? So just wanted clarification on that.
Yeah, and thanks for that question, Kelsey. I'll get us started on this one, and then I'm sure Josh and Kristen are going to chime in. So I think what you're talking about specifically is like a tenant opportunity to purchase, where tenants essentially get the first right, and then they can assign it to a qualified nonprofit. That's the way it's been done in a couple of other jurisdictions. I think that's what's under consideration currently in Berkeley, and it's the way it works in DC. Prior to starting the community engagement process for Copa, we actually went through another process, a 2-year process that started in 2018 called the Anti-Displacement Policy Network. As part of that process, we considered doing a TOPA program. But what we realized from both the community outreach and based on the just landscape analysis here in San Jose is that there were 2 factors that kind of made it very difficult for a TOPA to really work. One was sort of the kind of tenant organization that is usually required to be able for tenants to sort of work together to be able to purchase a property. We just didn't really see that infrastructure, and it wasn't really there at the time. Also, it's not really funded in the way that it is in DC or in San Francisco. The second thing is that based on sort of the folks that we're trying to reach, who are low income, 30 to 80% AMI, compared to the costs of purchasing, we didn't really see it as super viable or likely that the folks that we're really targeting or most at risk of displacement will be able to have the resources and the funds to be able to make qualified offers without subsidy. And so I think the idea was, if there's going to be subsidy involved, most likely it would usually go through some kind of organization or qualified nonprofit. One of the things that we heard, though, as part of the Copa process is that people really, really want to see a way or a pathway to home ownership for folks and for tenants. And so we decided to sort of craft the program to have the qualified nonprofits come in and be a safe harbor. But that safe harbor could be as short or as long as is necessary. So if you can think about it in this way, if the tenants really want this property and they want to purchase it, qualified nonprofit can just be a really transitional owner. And it just really depends on how long the qualified nonprofit will really be holding it. But that's a legitimate concern. Kristen?
No, I think you stated that well. There are different models to get people into home ownership, and we'll be bringing forward something separately, hopefully in the next 6 months, that kind of looks at Copa as a tool to use in that work. It's not a solution in and of itself, but there are lots of obviously, if somebody came forward with a rent-to-own purchase program for tenants to try to get some more folks in ownership, that we could look at that as we look at their qualifications in something like that. And we could look at a land trust model in which people don't absorb the full cost of purchasing the whole unit, but just a portion of it. So different things like that we'll be working on in a separate track. And thanks for sharing your experience, Kelsey. I had a similar experience several times over. So I know it's very nerve-wracking.
Thanks, Kristen. Let's hear next from David. I am noting that there's some chat about going out of order, and we are trying to prioritize people that we haven't heard from yet in this process. So I appreciate everyone's patience in that, and we'll definitely get to everyone. So David, if you'd like to go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Right. Thank you, Elizabeth. This question has to do with one that I had answered and that has bothered me quite a bit. And it has to do, again, with the qualified nonprofit. And the question that I asked is, how do they qualify? And they have to be, the answer was they have to be large enough and successful enough. And I think you've covered adequately what what that would entail. But they have to be able, then here was one of the answers. The usual grassroots nonprofits won't make the pick. Those large enough to qualify through a regular bank will. Now, the plan is to qualify for a property and get a regular bank loan, possibly a housing trust. The city would make an additional loan, something like $200,000 for remodeling or repairing with no scheduled payments, and take second position on securing the loan. Well, that's fine up until that point. But then it says that means if the nonprofit fails to make payments and the bank starts foreclosure, the city, in order to save its $200,000 investment, would have to take over the full responsibility for the property. Now, because the nonprofit is unincorporated or an LLC, they have no skin in the game. My question is, what kind of oversight is there going to be before, during, and after these nonprofits go through? It is a big, serious question.
Great, thank you. Yeah, thank you, David. I think we talked a little bit about this earlier, but because Jeff had asked a similar question about oversight, but yeah, I'm wondering
if I could make that comment. Thanks, David, for always pointing out that the numbers for our project have to work. And so as the city were to consider, and as the senior lender were to consider individual deals for debt, they'd be looking at specifics, looking at the net cash flow, if any. And just to be clear, the city's loans are typically paid out of a percentage of net cash flow after all operating expenses are covered. And so with no particular payment schedule, other than the balance in full due at time of maturity, which is a very long maturity. So, the city's repayment terms are quite flexible. So I mean, I know your mind's trying to go to the mechanics of any transaction. Both lenders would secure on the property. As with any other affordable housing loans, the city would attempt to problem solve before taking any other steps. Usually the senior lender has the right to take actions first, that we have some kind of standstill provision for some senior lenders. It depends on the subordination agreement and the provisions in there and who can do what at what time in case things don't go right. So just big picture, the city would be monitoring the properties every year We would be getting their net cash flow calculations. We'd be making sure that the affordability covenants were being adhered to. So that means that we'd be getting in information on the tenant's actual incomes and how the property was supposed to be operating and the rents that were supposed to be being charged. And so if there were any compliance problems, we would handle it through our normal compliance work in our asset management team, same as any other restricted affordable. So we could have findings of non-compliance. We could start, issuing letters to banks and things like that, which nobody likes. So, so it would go through the normal process. Does that help? Hopefully.
Yeah,
Well,
thank you.
I'm sorry, that helps up to the point of the real question is the city is going deeper and deeper, and what I see is a constant subsidization of these groups. So what's happening is you're replacing a private owner who pays taxes, keeps everything in order, and you're putting in a nonprofit who will be paid to do the same thing and not pay any taxes. And that's why I'm against it. I'm sorry.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
the reason we'd be pursuing this program is that the nonprofit affordable housing owners would be acting differently over the long run than a private owner would, and would not profit maximize at the time that they sell the property, for instance, would agree to extend affordability restrictions in perpetuity. So the properties would be being operated under both situations, hopefully adequately without problems, but really the outcomes would be a bit different, which is why we'd be pursuing the program to keep more people stabilized because the owner is not profit maximizing. Thanks, Elizabeth.
Thank you, Kristen. Let's take a question from the chat from earlier from Doug. This is about process. He's looking for clarification that if a qualified nonprofit submits a statement of interest on, let's say, day 15, then they'd have 25 days after that to submit an offer. He's asking, during that 40-day period, is the owner restricted from selling the property to somebody else?
Yes, I mean, that's the fundamental heart of the Copa program. But after that 40-day period, they could go through an offer process and the owner could refuse the nonprofit's offer. It could end earlier potentially, but it's up to a 40-day period. And after that up to 40-day period, the owner can put the property on the open market, and then there would be a final opportunity to make an offer for the nonprofit before there's a final sale. There have been some questions in the chat about, whether or not the owner would also be able to get another offer from the potential private buyer.
Mhm.
And as the city, right now we're saying we want to stand away from that. We're not going to get in between that. As long as the nonprofit has a right to make a final offer, the owner can go back to the other potential, that's fine.
If I could just also point out that it's really the initial 15-day period that folks would need to see if someone were interested. And again, as Josh said, hopefully we'd be looking at a technology way to see if there was any way to shorten that, where the qualified nonprofits could indicate earlier that they were not interested in a property. And so really that's going to be the vast majority of the properties that would be covered by the program. It is not 40 days, it would be 15. So I just wanted to clarify that. If somebody did intend to make an offer, then it's the 40 days. So that's the proposal.
Thanks, Kristen. Thanks, Josh.
Elizabeth, if I can comment. This is
Oh,
Doug.
sure. It's Doug. Oh, okay.
Thank you, Josh and Kristen, for all you do. We appreciate it. My question is, if a nonprofit has 15 days to respond, and on day 15, they decide, well, this may be something we may be interested in, then we've locked up this property for another 25 days. And for a seller who may have potential buyers who want to buy this property, they are now locked out for 40 days from selling this property. I mean, that's a huge concern, because a lot of investment property buyers are on a short timeline doing a 1031 exchange, and they have to identify a replacement property, and they can't wait to see if, well, in another 25 days or 40 days, we will be able to buy this property. So that's my question is, if the, if they have 15 days to identify the property or the nonprofit to select it, and then after they do, they've got 25 days to consider their offer. I mean, that's a huge concern from a homeowner or a seller's perspective, to have to wait to see if the nonprofit's going to bring a qualified offer to them.
Hi, Doug. Two things on that. One, I think you corrected yourself, but just be clear, this would not apply to single family homeowners. And so we saw a question in the chat of somebody who seemed perhaps to be a single family homeowner and has needs at home to take care of. And we are not purporting to cover those kinds of properties with this. Again, the proposal would be to not market the property or to accept offers during the period in which the letter of, a lot of cities call it the letter of intent, or letter of interest to make an offer. And I actually asked that we change it to the letter of intent, which means that for the qualified nonprofit that says, yes, I intend to make an offer on your property. It's not like I'm casually interested. Right. And so again, it comes back to that. If for some reason there would be a qualified nonprofit that would more than a couple of times issue that letter and then not follow through with a credible offer, that would be a problem of performance under the program. So that we would be addressing through the potential disqualification of that entity. So I want to emphasize that the offers that would be coming through would be based on projected appraised value and would be a fair market value offer, just as affordable housing developers offer all the time now for their properties as it is in the market. So we hear you saying that the delay is unattractive and for certain investors. And again, that is something to be taken into consideration with this program, but we don't believe because we are a large market and because we are not a tiny little market trying to do this on our own, that investors would therefore say like, oh, San Jose, that's not much fun to work in San Jose because of this new program, because it would be more universal, except for the carve outs. With like family inheritances, for instance, that the expectations would shift in the market. And so the expectations would not be out of line after a while. The other point is that I wanted to say we are taking feedback on the idea of this initial period, not just not taking offers, but also not marketing. And so we've invited comment on this piece during this initial period. If, for instance, folks thought, is there a way that we could market but not take offers during that period of time? Would that make the program more palatable? We're certainly taking comments and feedback on that as well. So these are proposed parameters.
And also, once the property is open for accepting offers, that would be our intent is that, the seller could reliably take those offers, so that there wouldn't be anything that, once the property is open, that there wouldn't be, anything that's going to pull the rug out from a potential buyer, so that, like, it's just about, like, the clock starts at a certain point, and then a seller can reliably accept offers. So once that door's open, there's nothing to preclude them from doing 1031 exchange. Sorry, I just had a knock on my door and the dog is barking.
And the
There's
dog
nothing
listen.
there's nothing to get in the way of an owner's ability to commit to a sale once they're in that, once they've opened the door to being able to offer publicly.
Yeah. If I
So
could
Josh-
quickly get,
Yeah.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Just to clarify, Josh, before your dog jumped in there. So if a seller is selling their property and we have a QNP who originally had made an offer that wasn't accepted by the seller, they put it on the open market and they accepted an offer, and the QNP came back and made a matching offer, the seller would not have to accept that matching offer.
The seller would not have to accept the matching offer.
Right, they
Correct.
could go ahead and move forward with whatever that
Yes.
other offer is, and there's no
Yes.
obligation. Okay,
Yes.
thank you. And I think
Yes.
that's a revision to previous conversations we've had. before.
I mean, very early on, we were trying to figure that out, but based on, but from conversations with you, Doug, we changed that. I mean,
Yeah.
we never, it's not that we changed it because this is the first official proposal of it, but
Right.
we know that in other jurisdictions, they do it as you suggested, and that's what we were looking at the beginning. But, based on your feedback, Tim, Mike, other folks, other brokers and realtors, we took that in and decided that for us in San Jose, that it would be that the seller has ultimate decision on whether or not they feel that they can sell to whomever they want, as long as there's the opportunity to make an offer. That's our proposal.
Thank you. I appreciate that revision.
Thanks, Doug. Thanks, Josh. Thanks, Kristen. I was going to go to a question from the chat from Cheryl, and she has her hand up as well. So maybe, Cheryl, if you could just unmute yourself. I can read your question out, but it's about the income, and I don't quite understand it. So you asked, would the income info be required after the purchase or before?
Right. So here's my question. What I see happening here, what it appears to me, is that tenants who are living in rent-controlled, eviction-protected properties are in danger of losing some of their protections, is what it sounds like to me. And there's a couple of reasons I say that. I had the question which Martha was referring to about the $5,000. I'll make that a little simpler. This is a real-world example. We have say there's a 6-unit apartment building, and 5 of the tenants fit in your 30 to 80% AMI. One of the tenants makes $100,000 a year, which is not, inconceivable. Okay, so the tenant makes $100,000 a year and is paying $1,900 a month for rent. That person is over your 80% AMI, and according to what you're saying about over-income tenants, this tenant who is paying $1,900 a month right now, their rent will be increased to $2,500 a month, because that will be 30% of their income. This tenant will now get a $600 rent increase. That's what you are telling me, okay? A $600 rent increase. Because
Okay, well, why don't we
so
go
that's
ahead and address that? I mean,
well, let me just finish. So that's one concern right there. And the reason I'm having to repeat this is because I brought it up last week. I didn't get a clear answer. And then Kristen said, well, if that's the case, maybe we could just do a tenant buyout and get the tenant to move out. Okay, that's where that conversation ended. Then the second part is this. I sent an email this week and I asked you, under the tenant protection ordinance, if a tenant wants to move in their parents, their spouse, their domestic partner, they can move them in, no questions asked, even if no matter how much that spouse or other person makes. That spouse could make $150,000 a year, whatever. And I asked under Copa, if this tenant now lives in a Copa building, and if they want to move in this family member, can they move them in without question? And that family member's income will not matter. It will not affect their rent or anything else. I didn't get an answer to that. The third thing, this is the third thing I want to know, is that currently, if I were to buy a rental property from someone, it would be illegal for me to ask any of the tenants how much money they make. It would be illegal for me to demand to know how much money they make and what their source of income is. That is illegal. But you're telling me if you're going to purchase a property under Copa, that you are going to demand that the tenants provide you income information. But it is illegal for me as a private owner to ask a tenant that. The only time a tenant legally has to give information about their income is when they first apply on their rental application. They are never allowed to be asked ever again how much money they make. The tenant.
So, sorry, I just want to make sure that I'm capturing all of it because
let me finish. Let me finish. I listened to all your guys' presentations for a long time. Let me finish.
Right, but I don't want to lose what you're saying because it's kind of hard to, when you multiple questions here. So I just want to make sure that I've got that correct.
I want to finish this last part. So what I'm saying is the tenant protection ordinance says that you cannot demand, no new owner can demand that a tenant gives income information. Okay, that is, they are protected from providing that. They may not want to provide it because of the amount they make. They may not want to provide it because of the source of that income. They may not want to provide that to you just because they don't want to provide that to you. So my question is, are you going, in all three cases, which I just mentioned, are you going to honor the tenant protection ordinance and the ARO? Are you going to let tenants know that they do not have to give you income information if they don't want to, and they can still live there, they can still pay their same rent, and they cannot be evicted? Because if I, as a private owner, went in there, I would have to adhere to that. Apparently, you have new rules, and the ARO and the TPO that were put into place to protect these tenants is not going to apply. You're going to alter those to fit your program. Thank you. That's my three questions.
Thanks, Cheryl. I could start with the last one first. And I appreciate you kind of going through the pieces of the tenant protection ordinance in your head that might conflict with what we're describing for restricted affordable homes. And so I think, so what I said at the last public meeting, when you asked the question, will the tenant protection ordinance apply? I said, yes, the tenant protection ordinance, it's our intention that the TPO do apply to these properties, but you're bringing up both the move-in question and then the income verification question that both under TPO don't fit. And I think what you're doing is showing, giving examples of why in the past, the staff just elected with the attorneys to just say TPO doesn't fit with restricted affordable units because they're different. Right? What you just described, those two examples were perfect examples of why it's kind of a different situation. And so your first question about can somebody move in their father or their child who comes home and what would happen, I think we would think through the ramifications of that. Typically, there is an assumed household occupancy assumption. And for affordable housing in order to set the rents. But if the household changes from 3 people to 4 people, everybody's incomes do get counted in their ability to pay rent and qualify. So per your second question about the TPO, correct. It is legal because for restricted affordable units, for the property managers to ask for a tenant's income information. And in fact, it's required to
Right.
ongoing certify that they remain eligible for the units that they are in. And so, and that is to, I brought up the question about a move out incentive at the last meeting, which we're happy to also take comments on. What if somebody's income goes up to 150% of area median income? And they can actually afford market rate rents with very little problem. And we have a very finite housing stock for restricted affordable units. Do we still say that those folks should be able to stay no matter what? And in Martha's comment, you should never raise their rents. So, so I think our thoughts are, how do we have a balance between not displacing people who don't have options, but also incenting people who do have options to take advantage of other options when these restricted affordable units are in such short supply. So Cheryl, thanks for bringing up these examples of where the tenant protection ordinance would not apply. And really when I made that statement, it was about the just cause eviction protections.
Okay,
Sure.
so let me,
That would apply.
if I can just finish up real quick. So that's why I asked you if the income information would be required before or after the building is purchased. Because before the building is purchased, the tenant is still under the TPO and the ARO.
Right.
So before the building is purchased, you cannot mandate that
I
any
concur.
tenants give you income information.
I believe that's right, Cheryl.
And I think it needs to be made very clear to the tenants that even if you do ask, that they do not have to give that information. After
That's right.
Building, I guess then they lose some of their TPO protections. I understand that. And then the other question is, I mean, I still didn't get a clear answer. So, and I realize I'm taking time, but I've asked many times and I want to get a clear answer. So if the tenant we're paying $1,900 a month and they make $100,000 and you buy the building, their rent will either go up by $600 or you will try to buy them out, is what it sounds like you're telling me. It sounds like that's what I'm hearing.
There would be an effort to right size that rent to 30% of the income of somebody who were over the target income for the program. And that we've also gotten feedback about, well, you wouldn't raise somebody's rents more than 5% in 1 year, right? Like, so we've gotten feedback on how that might work over time, but the proposal is to, yes, correct, raise rents for people who can afford it, so that they would be spending 30% of their gross income on rent plus a reasonable utility assumption.
Right. So if you
Correct.
did raise their rent from $1,900 to $2,500, they would clearly not be protected under the ARO. Their 5%, their ARO protections would be gone as well.
Well, we're seeking to replicate that 5% rent increase cap on the loan on the buildings under this program.
So you're saying even if you wanted to increase them from $1,900 to $2,500, you would only do it at 5% per year?
I think that's right. I think that's the takeaway from it. You'd have to do it gradually.
Is that what you're doing? It would just be 5%
yeah.
a year until they get to 2,500?
I think, and we could, again, like, our intention is not to displace people with sudden massive rent increases,
right,
regardless of income.
Things are
And when we say displace, I mean from San Jose, so
Yeah.
that they can't live in the market anymore.
Yeah, because
So,
these are real world examples, real tenants, real people, real world examples that really need to be addressed.
Right.
And sometimes when you say, because they're making 100,000, we want to move them up to 30% because they can afford that. If somebody's making 100,000, they may be self-employed. They don't have medical coverage. They don't fit into getting subsidized medical coverage. They may be paying $700, $800, $900 a month for medical coverage for a single person. So when you say they can't afford that may be your interpretation of they can afford, So those are the things that I'm very concerned about is tenants need to be made aware, depending on their circumstances, that they are losing and will lose protections because of COPA. Even if it just amounts to the fact that they're going to be forced to disclose their income.
That's right. That's one of those fundamental changes that we would ask the communication start early about, so people aren't surprised.
And the thing is,
That's right.
people may not want to disclose their income because of the amount, but there can be other reasons too. You don't know why and who or where their income, whatever, people, like I said, I couldn't do that as if I bought the building. I can't say, where does your income come from and how much do you make? I could never ask them to requalify. So, okay, thank you for.
Thank you, Cheryl.
Thanks, Cheryl.
Answering some of
Okay.
Thanks for your careful thought about the TPO. We appreciate that.
Thank you, because the tenants, somebody has to speak up for tenants that don't fit into your profile. It's
And
important.
the outlier cases and what to do. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
All right, let's go to Sam, who's had his hand up, and then we'll go back to the chat questions.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you all for the presentation and the information shared today. It's the first time I hear this presentation, and so I appreciate that. Apologize if my question might be repetitive a little bit in any way. It has to do, number one, I think that most of us, if not all of us, would agree that we should have ways to help people from being displaced. So anti-displacement program, I think, is a good intention. In terms of implementing a program, my understanding based on what I've read through the documents is that there are only 2 other cities in the United States that have this program. If that's correct, it's Washington, D.C. and San Francisco. And the third one is Berkeley, but Berkeley has not adopted that yet. Is that correct?
That's correct. It's going through committees, and I think they're expecting to vote this spring. Right now, I think it's scheduled for either March or April.
So we have 2 cities that have implementing this, and my understanding.
So 2 major, just a quick asterisk, 2 major cities that have opportunity to purchase programs. And the asterisk means that there are a lot of smaller, tinier jurisdictions that actually have opportunity to purchase programs.
So
is there many cities that are currently under consideration as well?
Good. So I think my question has to do more with the analysis of costs and benefits in order for us to see whether it's a good direction to move forward. Because I think these programs would involve tax dollars, which we all do pay tax into. Whether it's going to be ending up with the city or nonprofits, I mean, that's pretty much from tax dollars to some extent. And I think all of us have a part of that. So I think the question would be that in terms of cost and benefit, would you be able to point me to a document that may provide some type of an analysis of cost and benefit and impact, positive as well as negative impact on the entities that the stakeholders. And when I say stakeholders, I would say certainly the renter, and then the property owner, first-time home buyer or first-time investors, investors such as Steve, as we've heard a little earlier. What are the positive and negative impact on those folks? So I'd like to see some type of analysis in terms of benefits and costs, as well as impact and negative and positive impacts on those different entities there. Because I know that right now we're not doing single family homes, but if we want to see it happen, I mean, people maybe have a home or maybe investors that they want to invest into 2 homes or three units or 4 units. How would that impact them? Whether they have the opportunity to compete, or how is it positive and negative impact on those folks too? So is there a document that we can go in to see those analyses?
Yeah, so I'm gonna go ahead and try to address the first part of this. Really just a question of what kind of research and documents exist about costs and benefits. these types of programs. I hope somebody else on the team can potentially address this question of what the impact on competition for first-time purchasers or first-time investors looks like. Probably Josh or Elizabeth, do you have like quick access to the Copa library? I'm just going to tick through a few of these studies, and then if we can just copy paste them into the chat. So I think one of the more comprehensive studies of what's been of what opportunity to purchase programs looks like, done by the Center for Housing for Neighborhood Stability. It was commissioned by the city of Minneapolis that's currently considering an opportunity to purchase program. It has a really, really deep analysis of what opportunity to purchase programs look like around the country and sort of the proposed impact in Minneapolis. The second, the deepest, longest study was done in Washington, D.C. As I mentioned, I think it was mentioned by a couple of folks, Copa, Tenant Opportunity to Purchase, has been in place since the 1980s, has been there for 40 years. And if folks have any familiarity with the housing market in Washington, D.C., in the 1980s, the housing market was really depressed. There had been a lot of disinvestment, a lot of folks had moved out of the district. Obviously, that's changed now. And from what we understand, the Opportunity to Purchase program in DC has had little to no impact on housing prices. There are also actual research studies on what the impact of Opportunity to Purchase program in DC looks like. We also have links to that. One thing I will say, at least on the slightly negative side, there have been some instances of what would the best word be? Buyouts, sort of untoward activities around tenant holdouts in DC, especially around single family homes, and that's been addressed by a policy change in 2015. On top of that, what we've been looking at very specifically are opportunity to purchase program studies that are coming out, reports coming out of San Francisco and Berkeley, specifically the annual housing report from San Francisco from 2021. I kind of looked at their preservation program and the opportunity to purchase program. And so we can share that with you, and we're actually, I think, hoping to post that on the website fairly soon, so that people can get a sense of the research basis behind all of this. As far as the question around first-time investors or first-time owners, I really can't speak to that. Really, I don't think of this program really having a serious impact on the ability of investors to get into this market. There are, on an average year, up to 15 multifamily transactions every single year. It's unlikely, even in the best case scenario, for the qualified nonprofits or for the city to be able to subsidize that kind of activity. And so it's unlikely that it's going to have a serious impact on competition. But I'd love to hear if anybody else has other thoughts.
Sorry. Is that a question maybe for Josh or Kristen?
Yeah, the impact on first-time investors. Like I said, I don't think it will, but again, I don't have like a study to back me up on that.
Okay.
And maybe there's a link to what works well and what been challenging for those cities that have implementing these programs.
Absolutely. And the other thing, I just want to put another final point on this. Every opportunity to purchase program looks different depending on the city. The one that they're considering in Minneapolis includes single family homes, because you can buy a house in certain neighborhoods in Minneapolis for $80,000 cash, right? That's not true here. So obviously it'll be very difficult for us to be able to subsidize that kind of thing. An opportunity to purchase, the program in DC has a requirement for tenant associations, because they have a decade-long history of tenant organizing. Obviously, we're not requiring that because that's not what we have here in San Jose. What we are requiring here, of course, are things that are very San Jose specific. We're asking for a partnership between the qualified nonprofit community partner because we want them to have some tie to the community. We're making sure that the program is focused on low-income folks because that's who we know are really experiencing displacement. And so in some ways, we try to, opportunity purchase programs are really reflective of the issues and the problems that the cities are themselves trying to solve. And at the core of what Copa does, the core of an opportunity purchase program is that it creates a de minimis requirement to list your property and to issue a notice of sale to a small number of potential buyers. Those buyers then create a very potential large impact on the lives of tenants and residents who may potentially be displaced otherwise. And so what we try to do as much as possible is balance this idea of the cost of having to do this notice of sale process versus the potential very large impact on the households who can potentially benefit from being able to remain in place, have their rents potentially stay at an affordable price over time, preserve that non-renewable resource of affordable housing, and then also potentially, again, in the best case scenario, create pathways towards homeownership and asset building and wealth building for folks who have been locked out of those opportunities in the past.
Ethan, and thank you for your question, Sam. It looks like Matt had a follow-up question in the chat when you were speaking, Ethan, about kind of what the ballpark projection is for how many of these transactions would happen in a typical year. This out of the 1,500 sales, what do you think, maybe 8 to 10?
Sure. So it really just depends on what kind of support qualified nonprofits we can get in place. I think a really good starting point. It would be and it also really would depend on the number of units that are in each property. For example, if you end up getting 5 properties but 250 units, I think that was very successful effort. But you end up getting 30 units, but only 30 properties, but only 40, sorry, not 40, but only 80 units, can be a little bit less successful. I think it's really just going to depend on the scale of subsidy and the amount of qualified nonprofits that we're able to help generate and support as a city. The other factor I would say is how many actual opportunities would there be on an annual basis for qualified nonprofits to be able to purchase, and then are they in the areas that we really see displacement occurring? So that's the long and short of it.
Thank you. I just want to do a time check. It's 5:53 and we're going to wrap up by 6 o'clock. So I just want to thank everybody again for coming tonight. I'm going to post a meeting survey in the chat. If you have a minute or so, if you would be so kind as to fill this out for us so we can get your feedback on this process, that would be really helpful. And then if we could have the slides move forward to the last slide, so we can kind of get a, we can give an overview, or maybe the one before that. Yeah, so we can just kind of go over the remaining timeline of what's coming up. We're going to have a virtual meeting on February 9th. It's going to be in Vietnamese. We'll have that information posted to our website. There will be English interpretation at that meeting, but we're going to get that posted to our website shortly. And then, as mentioned before, in coming in winter or spring, we'll be getting to the Housing and Community Development Commission as well as the CEDC, and we'll have those dates posted and on our website. And you can continue to check our website for updates. And you know, if you've signed up for our Copa updates, we'll also be emailing out those sorts of updates about what's next in terms of the development of this policy. I want to see if any of our staff people have any anything they want to say before we sign off tonight. Kristen, Easton, or Josh?
Just want to say thanks. Obviously, we for folks who are especially new to this process, just want to say welcome and thank you so much for participating. We're not going away. Any more questions, if you want to just hold an individual meeting, we are more than welcome to do that. I think a lot of folks who are here on this call today, we've had individual meetings with. We're still very much open to continue this conversation individually.
Certainly. Thank you for that, Eason. Dr. Kristen, did you want to say anything in signing off? I hear something.
Oh, sorry. I was just, no, I'm good. I mean, just basic gratitude for everyone's participation, everyone's patience for what has been, and you know, it's not finished yet, but it's still what has been a long process. And you know, I know it doesn't feel like we're listening all the time, but we are, and we have made real movement in a lot of the things that we proposed based on the conversations that we have. We haven't like sat down and said, here's what you said, this one thing which caused us to do it. We haven't, dissected it in that way, but we really are listening and we really are moving. And some of the things that, some of the things are still in development too. We really do want to create more home ownership options through this, or ownership alternative options through this. It's not necessarily going to be part of the initial ordinance, but it is something that we have not dropped. It's something that we are still actively working on, in fact. So I just want to say that we do really appreciate everybody, and we are listening throughout all of this.
Thanks for that, Josh, and thanks for addressing the home ownership discussion, because there was some stuff coming up about that in the chat. So I appreciate you mentioning that here at the end. And I just want to thank again everyone for coming tonight. We will be posting the slide deck from this presentation, which is very similar to the last 3 public meetings, and hopefully a recording of this presentation as well to our website. So please check there for updates, and we can end 2 minutes early. So thank you again for everyone for coming and for all your great questions and for helping to advance the thinking on this policy. So good night and thank you.